Hey, I'm just going to make this very crystal clear. Y'all are either going to have to fight or you're going to die. They're coming for our water. They're coming for water. They don't want us to live a life where we have water. We're already paying for it, but they want us just basic consumptions so they can have it for what they want. You're going to either fight or you're going to die because none of us can survive without water, and they don't care about us. If you're not serving little white America in the Middle East, if you ain't working, then you're obsolete. And honestly, they don't really need us because they can build welfare cities all over this country. That's all they care about, data centers and welfare cities. If you understand what I'm saying, you know, just look up deed theft. Y'all are living in fucking la la land if you think you're going to go back to what you think America used to be, which was just a smoking mirror anyway. You're going to have to fight or you're going to die. That's the bottom line on top.
I'm sure I'm a little bit behind the curve on this, but I just recently learned that water, the one thing that we need for survival, is now being publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange. It's kind of wild to think about, because when you think about all the other stuff that's publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange, it's usually not a good scenario because it usually becomes more about profit and greed than it does anything else. So when I first learned about this, I was like, man, I need to look into this. I need to do some research and see what's going on here, see why it's happening and what that's going to mean for us. And I'm just going to tell you right now that what I discovered is pretty darn crazy. It's actually kind of dark, maybe borderline nefarious, kind of scary, but I took some notes down and I'm going to share those with you because I think this is very, very important. And it pays to be prepared. You know, knowing what's coming and being prepared for it is going to pay in the long run no matter what the situation is. So let's just dive straight into this, all right? I've got a bunch of notes here, and I want to also say that this isn't just about water. This ties into a lot of other stuff, which is equally just as terrifying, all right? So first of all, I learned about this, and I found out that it started being publicly traded back in December of 2020. All right, so instead of water now being a basic right and a human, well, let's say a human right and a basic necessity, it is now a commodity. It's monetized, it's tokenized. That's the key thing to keep in mind here. So water went from being the basic human right to now being big business. And now in 2026, 6 years later, business is booming because there are now roughly about 15 regulated water companies that are now being publicly traded. And I mean, combined, they're worth billions and billions of dollars. And there are people that are getting quite rich. And when you look at all the people that are investing in these stocks, it's not just us little guys here at the bottom trying to make a buck. It is, of course, the private institutions, these humongous private investment firms that are worth multiple trillions and trillions of dollars. And you know, I thought about this and I'm like, $1 trillion sounds like a lot of money. But when you visualize it, this is going to blow your mind, but you can actually stack $1 bills, $1 trillion worth of $1 bills into a column, and it will literally reach the moon. That is how much money $1 trillion is. And now we have these private investment firms that are worth multiple trillions of dollars that are investing into water. And what do these companies care about? How did they get so rich? They care about profit. So naturally, that led me down some more rabbit holes, we'll call them. And I started thinking about what incentive do they have to invest in something like water? Because water, I mean, it's the most abundant thing on the planet. 71% of the Earth's surface is water. So I'm like, you know, it's everywhere. So how could it be worth so much money? And this is where things get pretty interesting. So 5% of the Earth's water is fresh water. That's a lot less than 71%. And of all of the water on the planet, only 0.5% is accessible and safe for human consumption. So when you think about that, that paints an entirely different picture on this entire scenario. And it gets even crazier because we have these leaders, whether they be self-appointed or elected officials. It doesn't really matter, but these leaders, these people that are in charge or think they're in charge, telling us these things over the last 5, 6, 7 years, And it's very important to pay attention to what these people are saying, because usually what they say comes true. They don't tell us these things just to talk. They tell us these things because usually it's exactly what they're doing, and it's exactly what they have planned. So one of the things they've been telling us is the next crisis, the next global crisis, is going to be a water crisis. Comes straight from the horse's mouth. And we also have these leaders and these elected officials telling us that water is no longer a human right, and that they need to monetize and tokenize the natural world. And I'm talking everything. Trees, rivers, streams, the forests, animals. If it's in the natural world, if it exists around us, they want to monetize it. They want to tokenize it, because they've realized that these things, these resources that we have around us that we all take for granted, they're actually very finite. And some of them become scarce. And when there's scarcity in anything, but there is significant demand, there can be a monetary potential for that. And there's the potential to get very, very rich. So that is exactly what they're doing. That's why they've capitalized on water, and that's why they're capitalizing on natural resources and the wildlife and everything around us that should be a God-given right. And when you think about something like water, water is actually becoming very scarce right now, because streams, rivers, lakes, stuff like that, they're drying up. There are certain, bodies of water that are 20, 30% less than what they used to be. And that's a major problem, because when these large bodies of water dry up, and then we have things like aquifers and wells that are drying up, what happens when we run out of water? What happens when water becomes scarce? And, right now it seems like that might be kind of a far-fetched idea, but as this progresses, I think we're actually going to realize these things. Because another thing that's happening is that data centers are being installed all over the country. Right now there's about 5,500 in the country, and by 2030 there's supposed to be around 12,000. And the problem with that is that a large hyperscale data center can consume 5 million gallons of water a day. That is the same amount of water as what a town of about 50,000 people would consume in a day. And that's just one data center. And now we have 5,500 again, potentially 12,000 within the next 4 years. And when these data centers consume this water, some of it gets recycled and put back into the environment. But of that water that gets put back into the environment, most of it gets put back in the form of water vapor. So it's essentially steam. And it goes back up into the natural water cycle, but it takes a long time for that to get replenished in the lakes and the streams and the aquifers and the wells. So these things run dry. And that is what we're seeing around a lot of these giant data centers, is that they're running the natural water resources dry. So there are many places that are already claiming that they're in a water crisis. And that is not a good scenario. But again, when there is a limitless amount of demand, but the supply starts to become restrained, guess what happens to the price of that thing? It goes up. We see that with gold. We see that with other natural resources, things like diamonds and oil. All these things are finite. There's a limit to how much we can draw out of the earth. And as these things become more scarce, the price and the value goes way, way up. So I find it kind of convenient that these people are tokenizing and monetizing this very specific natural resource at a time when we are kind of facing a potential water crisis and a shortage. And the problem with that is that it's not like oil, where you can find alternative means to power things. Water is water. There is no substitute. We have to have it to survive. It is a basic human necessity. So when there is demand, there is a demand with a capital D. That demand is never going to diminish. It's never going to go away. And that, in the eyes of these investors, probably means that that is unlimited money. But as I started digging into this further, I started to notice that this bled into, like I mentioned before, everything natural in our world. So let me just go through some prime examples here. So there is now such a thing as a carbon and biodiversity credit. And what this is tradable certificates that fund measurable, durable conservation and restoration of ecosystems. kind of sounds like a bunch of word salad. But what this does, this allows private equity companies to finance wildlife conservation, getting X amount of credits for X amount of land or natural resources, and a dollar amount is then assigned to each credit. So in other words, if I'm a private equity company or a private firm or private investor, I could come in and I could buy, certain parts of your land. Let's say I want to buy 100 acres. And if I commit to maintaining wildlife conservation on that land, and I take steps to, capture carbon and protect the animals and to protect the trees and the natural resources, then that is then assigned a dollar amount on that token, and I can trade that in for money. And like I mentioned before, this applies to everything natural. So we're talking lakes, streams, rivers, mountains, trees, elk population, deer, salmon, fish, you name it. If it's out in the natural world, there is the potential for it to be tokenized and monetized. But the catch here is that in order to maintain conservation and to get, the value of the credit, you have to prohibit people from using the land for productive means. In other words, you can't hunt or fish, you can't forage. It is off limits to people. So you're basically privatizing what would be public land or land that could be used for production. And not only are you privatizing it, you're putting it in the hands of investors and people that are in it for the money and in it for profit. And there are actually some countries like the UK that are now required by law to achieve a mandatory 10% biodiversity net gain. And Oregon is another prime example of this. An entire state forest, which is Elliott State Forest, about 83,000 acres, has now been rolled into credit registry.